series. We have done almost 270 webinars so far, and we started just before COVID. So you can well imagine the series is totally booked till end of June. So the interest that the series is generating is really, we ourselves are very impressed. The nook and corner of the country, there are people who tune in, and then there are recordings that are played even after the event is over. And we feel very flattered, and we also feel very humbled that there are people joining us from our neighboring countries who also take advantage of this webinar series. So I want to really welcome today on this important topic that we are facing across the world. As you know, under this series, we have done most contemporary issues that are relevant for economics as well as geopolitics. These seminars have generally focused on these two topics. In the past, we have done, and I'm so happy all the three speakers, the chair and the two panelists today, have been with us earlier because we have been watching the Russia-Ukraine war very closely and its implications for countries across the world, including India. What has happened in the last 3 months is extremely worrisome for professional economists. The trade wars, the tariff war, which we had seen in front of our own eyes, just melt away, and then the benefits of globalization suddenly seem to be now in peril. Things are changing. While the tariff wars are going on, there was this huge interview which we watched, all of us across the globe, which was very stunning for many of us. At the middle of all this interview that I'm referring to was the minerals that Ukraine has and who will finance the war. These things get so correlated that we thought, who should be the best to come and speak to us and enlighten us as to what are the economic implications of such steps. So we invited, and we are very fortunate, Professor Barry Eichengreen on the other side of the planet, and you can note that from the timing, finally, kindly agreed. And of course, Professor Yuriy, who's from Ukraine and is at Berkeley. Then we wanted somebody who knows the global situation to chair the session and guide us. So we requested Ambassador Manjeev Puri to be with us. Let me briefly introduce the speakers for the day, and then I'll hand over to Ambassador Puri. Ambassador Puri is a retired Indian civil servant, a dear friend of mine from the Indian Foreign Service cadre, very elite, and former ambassador of India to Nepal. In his diplomatic career, he joined the IFS, Indian Foreign Service, in 1982, and his career spanning over 36 years, he has served in different capacities in Indian missions abroad and in India's foreign ministry, including a number of multilateral organizations such as United Nations, European Union. He is also an expert on climate. We have two speakers for the day, and both the speakers are extremely well known. Professor Barry Eichengreen has been on EGROW webinar earlier. He is the George C. Pardee and Helen N. Pardee Professor of Economics and Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley, where he has taught since 1987. He has widely published, extremely well known, and his publications and his research has endeared him across the planet. He has been to India earlier also. Professor Yuriy is an economist and Quant Edge Presidential Professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He has been also here at the EGROW webinar series earlier. He is also a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, a faculty research associate at NBER, a research fellow at the Institute of the Study of Labor. He was the chair of the International Academic Board of the Kiev School of Economics. With this, all the three illustrious speakers and panelists with us today, I hand over the session to Ambassador Puri.
Professor Charan Singh, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. You can. Thank you very much, Professor Charan Singh, and thank you, EGROW. And I'm so delighted to see the wonderful success of this great platform and the privilege that I've had to be associated with it in the past and through our friendship. Thank you very much. Professor Charan Singh, you've introduced us. Let me just say a few words about the two very distinguished panelists we had. Professor Barry Eichengreen, of course, was also with the IMF, but to all of us who studied economics, he is really the guru of the gold standard. So since we are not talking about all that today, but that needs to be another webinar altogether as to what's happening with the currencies, what's happening with the dollar, the gold. I'm not talking about the fascination of the gold color and it being all over the biggest office in the land, etc., but the gold standard. And he's also written a publication which I think is very contemporary and wonderful on the populist temptation. So, Professor Eichengreen, several other webinars are due. Let me also welcome Professor Yuriy Gorodnichenko. Professor Charan Singh, you've already said he's from Ukraine. Nobody can speak on these subjects more than somebody who, in a sense, has a feel for it. He runs the Voice of Ukraine, is known by many people as one of the finest top young economists around today. So we are very, very happy to have you here because some matters are the matters of the mind. And we can all sit and do this dissection in various ways. But I think the heart also matters, and that's important. Now, before I ask you both to delve into the subject, I'm going to ask Professor Charan Singh, and before he sort of mutes his camera. Professor Charan Singh, we had discussed, the ideas of this webinar. And you had come up with a series of questions, which I'm sure you've posed across to our panelists. What I want you to do is to just spend a few minutes and elaborate. Why I say so is because it then sets the template for what they will be addressing. And I'll say a few words at the end on my own side. Professor Eichengreen and Professor Gorodnichenko. My background is diplomacy. I used to be India's ambassador to the European Union for a long time, the deputy permanent representative to the UN, lots with this climate change, but, of course, very much involved with global governance and what I'm seeing happening. And I've lived in your country for several years, so I think I do have a certain feel for it. But let's get down to the meat of it. And let me ask Professor Charan Singh to do a little bit of the introduction, which has gone into his framing this particular webinar itself. So Professor Charan Singh, the screen is yours.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this opportunity. And you know that when this whole thing was unfolding, I was discussing with Professor Eichengreen that there is something which is very perplexing and disturbing. And we were discussing together, and I'm sure Professor is going to dwell on this. The issues that came up in my mind were economic reasons for the war. I thought they were very, very different from what suddenly it emerged out of that interview. Is it oil, like in the Middle East? And now in Ukraine, it's the minerals. So what was the war all about? So that was sort of very, very worrisome to me because as economists, as a professor, many times we would be facing this question. At the end of it, it's all economy, it's all oil, or it's all wealth. The second issue was, like in this situation that is happening, is it the economics of seeking support for keeping predators away from a country? And there's a fear that because we are mineral rich, somebody else can scoop on us. And that reminded me of what was happening in Afghanistan. Also, now I've been spending lots of years of my life in banking, practical banking, before I was with the academia. And in practical banking, sometimes we have something called reverse mortgage, where I can mortgage my house and live happily. In a country like this now, are the minerals going to be used as reverse mortgage? So, like I understand what happened in the oil 50 years, 100 years ago, but are we seeing it unfold in front of our own eyes now? So we have read about it, lots of it. Is it the mercantilist world now that we are in? And what are the economic implications of this mineral deal that has come out so openly? Finally, we had a unipolar world, which became bipolar and then tripolar. And now, with Russia having lost its sheen in 1991, are we back into a very complex multipolar world? So those were the type of issues that were in my mind when I approached Professor Barry and Professor Yuriy and Ambassador. That is when I approached you, saying that I am really lost in this thoughts. But over to you. So I'm just sharing my raw thoughts. Thank you.
Professor Charan Singh, thank you very much. No, you're not lost. Many would say that most of us are confused, but we now have experts to unravel this for us. My dear panelists, I want to take a minute of your time just to tell the audience here, which is predominantly from India and countries in our neighborhood, where the predominant narrative that we've got, either from the BBC, the CNN, or from internet sources, is one of a conflict dealing with the that there is politics in it, data, neocons, and all this. But I just want to tell them a few very interesting nuggets, and please correct me if I'm wrong. The first one is that you long been known as a critical minerals powerhouse. Indeed, people say that nearly more than 120 most globally used metals and minerals have some kind of a Ukrainian element to it, and Ukraine is there in it. And it used to be among the largest suppliers of neon gas, which is used in microchip making, and it has extremely significant known deposits of lithium, deposits of titanium, nickel, manganese, uranium, and all of these. But very interestingly, the largest concentration of all these is on the end. One would dare say that currently under Russian occupation, and what is the charge going back to the Ukrainian people, I would find it difficult to bet that that would happen. So we'd be very happy to hear what you have to say. There's obviously geopolitics of an old kind, but modern era requirements are also there. And then we have all the issues of rent seeking, etc. So I'm not going to take up more of your time, sir. I want to see the two panelists who will enlighten us to get into the act. Professor Eichengreen, may I please request you to first take the screen? And since we have about an hour, already used up about 15 minutes, may I request you to speak for about 10 to minutes as you wish? Then Professor Yuriy, for you, then we'll open it up to the others who are there, and then finally wrap up in about 45 minutes from now. Sir, the screen is yours.
Thank you. So before I start, let me alert your readers to the fact that there is an important resource for thinking about the Ukrainian economy and the impact of the war at the Center for Economic Policy Research website. And my colleague Yuriy has been really spearheaded that effort to put together a series of reports on the managing the impact of the war on the Ukrainian economy, thinking about Ukraine's post-war recovery. I don't think we have touched on the mineral resources issues very much because they were suddenly injected into the debate earlier this year and were all still trying to figure out with what implications. I do agree with what both of you have said about how this debate has a peculiar back to the future aspect about it, that in the early 20th century, for example, oil was discovered in what is present-day Iran, and that set off a scramble between the Americans and the British and the Russians about who would control those resources. Many of us, certainly yours truly, thought that we had moved beyond that era where countries, regardless of whether they were early industrializers or late industrializers, controlled the resources that were within their sovereign borders. And that presumption has been somehow now cast into doubt once again. Most of us believed and continue to believe that this war is about the defense of national sovereignty and national self-determination, and that we, as global citizens, share an interest in seeing that there is an outcome that affirms that those values, rather than simply a transactional outcome where each party tries to get as much for itself that it can. So I would also, maybe a final word, and then I'm happy to turn things over to Yuriy. I would caution against the fallacy of believing that there is some internal logic to what the Trump administration and the US are doing at the moment vis-a-vis Ukraine. We, as scholars and economists and diplomats, are trained to look for an internal logic or a coherent strategy behind any set of initiatives. And there is it seems to me, the distinct possibility that there is no coherent strategy here in this case, but so there may simply be an incoherent, chaotic strategy unfolding here, and it's hard to know how to deal with it when you're on the receiving end. So I think to date, the government of Ukraine has avoided falling into the trap of being overly provoked, thinking that retaliation is the right thing to do. I believed until maybe a week or so ago that the government of Ukraine had been quite successful at shifting the burden of proof, if you will, onto Moscow and Russia, in the sense that Moscow and Russia had to demonstrate that they were also sincerely committed to a ceasefire and negotiations and so forth. As we speak here today, it's not clear that Mr. Putin believes that he has to demonstrate a willingness to sit down and negotiate. And as I said before, it's hard to infer what the reaction of the US government to that intransigence will be. But here we are.
Eichengreen, thank you very much for what you said. Just before we move on to Professor Yuriy, what if I leave with you these kind of thoughts? That while most of us were taken in on these Make America Great Again, personal ambitions, and in the case of Ukraine, there is a little element of that too, the personal, what should I say, vindictiveness or whatever you may call it, all that. But if I leave all that out, what do you think, and I'll come to you on this later after Professor Yuriy has spoken, on the fact that on the one side you have all this business of Make America Great Again and the tariffs, etc. But on the other hand, you have a huge supporting cast, which is down to, let me say, deconstruct the guardrails, both in America and the countries which really matter, which is Europe, Canada, and I'm not saying Greenland, but that. And therefore, who are the two major players in this game? The newest tech guys, AI, artificial intelligence, the internet, and the entire set of people on all of that in your part of the world. And then the old tech, the ones who have the last, let me say, 20, 30 years of their hooray, the mining, the oil industry, and so on. And so, therefore, some kind of a method, if I may say so, in this madness is, to use this Harold Robbins expression, there's a kind of carpetbaggers at it. But anyway, I got an opportunity. I said what I had to. Professor Yuriy, the screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you. You know, when we think about this mineral deal, I think it's important to remember the history of this process. Initially, the idea was that the US is going to offer Ukraine some type of protection, you know, military support, maybe even put troops in Ukraine to defend Ukraine in exchange of this access to mineral resources. The current version of this deal doesn't have any security elements at all. So this is a purely commercial deal. And as such, I don't see this as being a particularly attractive option for Ukraine. Also, we should understand that this deal is going to contradict not only the current legislation in Ukraine, but it will also contradict the European aspirations to join the European aspiration of Ukraine to join the European Union, because the European Union does not like any exclusive deals with the Americans or anybody else really, and so you can immediately see lots and lots of contradictions there. I'm not sure this deal is going to be ratified by the Ukrainian parliament. In fact, I'm pretty sure it has zero chances to pass the parliament. So I don't think it's likely to happen. But as Barry said earlier, it's a very tight sort of balancing act where you have to not upset Trump, but at the same time kind of show some type of willingness to keep this thing going. You know, keep talking about this, and that's a challenge. I think we also should understand that, you know, if we had all these wonderful resources in Ukraine for so many years, the question is why they were not explored earlier. And, you know, maybe, you know, property rights are not particularly great in Ukraine. That's one explanation. Another explanation is that, yes, we have all these different deposits. Ukraine is a big country. So by the law of large numbers, you have to have something in the ground in this land. But you know, maybe it was not profitable in the first place to mine lithium or titanium or uranium or other minerals. You know, you have other places on Earth where it's going to be more profitable, and this is where the investment went. And so I'm kind of struck by the discussions today that, you know, somehow, you know, we have this unimaginable wealth in Ukraine that was sitting there waiting for the right moment, and only now people have discovered this. I think it was there, it just, you know, maybe it's not economic to use this resource. And also, again, going back to the point that Barry made about, you know, madness versus logic, the idea that somehow Ukraine is going to generate a lot of revenue for America very quickly is not true, right? So when you think about how much time it will take to do a geological survey, then build the facilities, then build infrastructure to export whatever you mine there in Ukraine, we're talking probably about 5, 10, maybe 15 years. So this is going to be a very, very long process, and you're not going to have a return on this anytime soon. And given how unstable this region is now, I'm not sure many businesses would be willing to put significant money in Ukraine when they know with some probability this factories, mines, whatever, may be attacked by the Russians again. You know, just think about this. You know, we have many US firms who invested in Ukraine before. There is a famous company called Cargill. It's an agricultural business. It had a massive investment in eastern Ukraine. It lost all of it. Did it help Cargill in any way that it's an American company? No, it didn't. Nobody came to rescue. Nobody gave any protection. You know, Marines or whoever didn't come to rescue these guys. They lost everything. And you can imagine this can happen again. As one mentioned earlier, Afghanistan is a prime example where you sign a minerals deal, but it means nothing in terms of security or long-term success of the country. So I'm skeptical that this mineral deal is going to help Ukraine resolve US problems or be a good deal in any other way. So I think it's a deal from hell, if anything. I'll stop here.
We're not able to hear you.
Professor Yuriy, thank you very much. Look, let me say something. We are all on the same page. We may have all kinds of words about the so-called liberal rules-based order, etc., etc. Forget all that. We are all part of that. But let's also try, for the purposes of the general discussion. And my sympathies are with you. Not only that, my empathy is with you. I agree with you. How can all this be exploited so quickly? Look at the time frame that it takes, and so on and so forth. Ukraine, being an agricultural superpower, was known to everyone. Remember the deal for the Africans to be supplied right from the beginning. So we all know this particular thing. We are also aware of the Europeans and the situation that they get caught in, and the geopolitics that the Ukrainian leadership finds itself into, which is, both their major friends. One doesn't have the abilities and the other is turning around. So as they say, sometimes, when your big backer and you need the backer simply changes, life becomes very difficult. And you mentioned the question of the Russians, etc. So we'll certainly talk about this particular aspect of what is happening and is there any kind of logic to it. Although one logic one could see is that the Ukraine business putting out all these mineral deals, all right, there was an element to, old personal issues in all of this. But really the thing was, it allowed you to go ahead with the Russians. It gave you a kind of cover for that. So happy to have, if you have any quick reactions to that. Otherwise, I'm very happy to open it up to our colleagues, because we have about 30 minutes, and this perhaps would be a matter of great interest to many of them to, pick the brains of people who perhaps know and can at least understand what's unfolding on the other side of the Atlantic, because it's important for everyone here. Professors, any of you would like to say something on this business of opening up to Russia?
I'm happy to let you open it up.
Okay. The floor is open. The screen is open. All those who want to say something, please go ahead. What is the system, Vivek? People raise their hands. How does it work? Is this too technical a discussion? No one's interested. No one seems to figure out, or everyone is as confused as all of us.
While people are coming up with questions, I will say a few things.
Please go ahead, Yuriy.
if it's okay.
The most qualified among us.
I would say this. It's very clear by now that the Trump administration doesn't care about Ukraine or Europe, for that matter, and so the objective here is to sign a quick deal, claim victory, maybe a Nobel Prize for peace, and then when the war erupts again, they just wash their hands and let other people pick up the pieces. In Ukraine, people are obviously very clear in their minds that this is not a situation that we want, right? So any kind of ceasefire has to have some form of enforcement, right? And at this stage, it's not clear who is going to do the enforcement. It's not going to be the US. It's not clear Europe can do it. We have all sorts of stories that Brazil or China, I don't know if India was invited to be a peacekeeping force in Ukraine, probably not. Anyway, so it's not clear that there is any clear security guarantee that this is going to work. This is going to be sustainable. And so as a result, I think we should understand that the baseline scenario here is that this war of attrition will continue for a long time, maybe a year, maybe 2 years. As an example, the Iraq-Iran war continued for 8 years. We're in year 4, so sometimes to go. It's true, Ukrainian economy is not big enough to support this war of attrition for a long time. But if you combine Europe, which is, I think, very much terrified now by the fact that Russia is a threat and US is not going to protect Europe. So if you take Europe, combine this with Ukraine, then you have a fighting force, which is Ukraine, and you have resources to pay for it, which is Europe. And so if you have a union of these two forces, then this war of attrition against Russia can go on for a long, long, long time. And so all these deals about, the minerals and so on, I think this is just smoke and screen, and there is really nothing fundamentally, changing this calculus. So I'll stop
Uh,
here.
Yeah. Now, Yuriy, let me just pitch in for a minute, and then I'll turn to Professor Charan Singh, who wants to ask a question. Look, the political calculations of the individual, and I'm not talking about the state, of the individual, are kind of known to us. We all come from democracies. We understand how these things work. Declare a victory. Last time you didn't get the Nobel Prize, you think you'll get it this time. But if I leave all that out, and I look at the issues vis-a-vis Europe, whether we like it or not, the old neocon policies have resulted in Europe getting kind of economically diminished. Many other issues have happened as a result of this. Now, right or wrong is a completely different subject altogether. Their abilities to pump in and substitute, plug the gap, as they say. Well, the Polish leader, Tusk, was very clear that if you add up the numbers, it comes to that. But the fact of the matter is, and I don't want to say that they've been free riders, but they've taken that for granted in various ways. So their abilities to pitch in and do that appears limited. Now, is there a real threat from the other side? Look, as a Ukrainian, you would understand that best, and I bow to whatever you say. I'm sitting very far away about that. But I get the feeling that the interest levels, as you said very rightly, are very limited. They are about being applauded for a victory gained. I told you in 24 hours, all right, it's taken 24 weeks, doesn't matter, and go ahead and so forth. I fully understand all of that. But so on the economics, at least from what I could make out from the two of you, there's kind of dodginess. So no one understands. You can, stitch some kind of a logic that if an American company has the lease, the Russians will be scared of coming there. I'm not sure. If the Russians already have most of the minerals, they'll do a deal with the American company. So one doesn't know all of that. But let's hear what our colleagues have to say. Professor Charan Singh, you were the first to raise your hand. Then there was somebody from the Central University of Gujarat who wanted to speak. Professor Saab, as the director, you have first right.
So I thank you so much, Barry and Yuriy. You have given your points very, very clearly. I have a question, one for each of you. Professor Barry, you are the professor at Berkeley on political economy and political science, and you know the economy is quite closely related with the politics. Now, it's been long since we saw that a country which we thought was defending out of altruistic motive for the planet, suddenly starts talking in terms of economic costs and economic benefits and paying for the war. Means, did you ever anticipate, or do you think, is this the way that a political superpower in future would be behaving? By the way, we are the neighbors of China, and many times I wonder whether China does most of its activities altruistically or also has an economic angle. Sri Lanka is a recent example. Professor Yuriy, we are a country which have been in a very difficult geopolitical situation, we as Indians. We have paid a cost for being neutral, and we have tried very hard to stay neutral. And earlier, when we got our independence, we had a policy of neutrality. And even afterwards, though the political parties have changed in power, that neutrality is very closely guarded. Do you think that the economic aspects were probably not thought through by the political powers, and Ukraine has got stuck, maybe because of its myopic policies or because it never understood that the bigger political game can be devastating, and Afghanistan was only taken as an aberration, but not as an illustration. Thank you.
Professor Charan Singh, thank you very much for that. Very important questions, contextualizing our scenario. I just leave a little thought for both of you, Barry and Yuriy. You know, détente versus neocon policies. But let me leave that out. There was somebody from the Central University of Gujarat who wanted to ask a question. Are you there, Professor? No one? No one else? Okay. Please go ahead. The screen is yours. Yuriy and Barry.
Well, Sharon asked me whether I could have ever imagined the economic and political turn that the superpower that is the United States has taken, and I'm more than willing to acknowledge the limits of my imagination. No, I could have never imagined or anticipated much of what we have seen unfold in recent months and years, that the US would take a mercantilist economic turn of the sort it has, and an isolationist, but a aggressively isolationist geopolitical turn at the same time. So I would echo what you said about how this poses challenges for those of us in the United States. It poses challenges for the world as a whole, but it also poses challenges for proudly non-aligned economy countries like India. There's that old phrase about how there are no atheists in foxholes, that when things get really difficult, sometimes one has to choose sides, as it were. And since we are here today, I wonder, at what point does India become part of this coalition of the willing, which includes Europe and Canada and others who are willing to lend either moral or economic or military support to Ukraine?
Thank you very much, Barry. I'll also pitch in with my 2 bits on those subjects. But Yuriy, for you first.
You know, I would first start by saying that, you know, there are certain historical parallels there. You know, India had, you know, independence, democracy, post-colonial sort of development. Ukraine used to be a Russian colony. It's always a difficult process of separating from an empire. And certainly Ukraine, when it declared independence, said it's going to be neutral, and it said it's going to have no nuclear weapons. Now, the Indian experience is interesting. It's true that India is a neutral country, but it also has nuclear weapons, which is kind of striking, right? So you don't want to have a war with anybody, but you have to prepare for all sorts of scenarios with difficult neighbors. You know, Ukraine did not choose this war, right? So it wasn't some type of geopolitical game or some economic dispute between Russia and Ukraine. It was just a blatant attack on Ukraine to bring Ukraine back into the Russian Empire. So it wasn't about minerals or anything like this. Russia is such a huge country; they don't need Ukrainian minerals. They can mine anything they want in their lands. So I don't think it was, you know, a purely economic argument for why Russia attacked Ukraine. Unfortunately, Ukraine happened to be in this gray area. You know, you mentioned spheres of influence and so on. This was understood that Ukraine is in the Russian sphere of influence. That's why I was not invited to join European Union when the Soviet Union collapsed in the 90s. And so, you know, once you have a country which is a neutral, doesn't have nuclear weapons, nobody claims it, so to say, then obviously some big powers can move in and claim this land. Unfortunately, for Ukraine, it means a very brutal invasion, and you have to defend yourself. You know, one thing which is really troubling me about, you know, superpowers and how we're going to live in this new world, the US shows a very transactional approach. Like, we give you support, but you pay us with something. That's not how you're supposed to treat your allies, right? Because if you do this deal with the US, then everybody else can say, well, we give you something, say Germany, and then Germany could say, we also want to have a piece of Ukraine. Then France will also ask for a piece of Ukraine. And so this process can continue for a long time, and then none of Ukraine is going to be left for Ukrainians. That's not how you help friends. And unfortunately, I don't see how we can stop this equilibrium from happening. But what I want to say is that neutrality is wonderful. It's great, but sometimes you cannot stay neutral when you're attacked by somebody else. And unfortunately, I also see that China and Russia are building sort of an axis together. And if I were India, I would be very worried that this axis may result in something aggressive in the future.
Yuriy, thank you very much for what you said. I have a personal sort of view. Neutrality is possible if the biggest people around you want you to be neutral. So the famous country that we talk about in Europe is because of that reason, my understanding. Your situation for a country like India is not very dissimilar to our relations with Nepal. But, let me leave that out. That's a completely different subject. Let me ask you both, what do you think of this? The Dayton, which brought about the USSR, then sort of folding up, etc., resulted in, of course, people saying, and very reportedly, that, look, be mindful that, Russia remains what it is an important player, etc. And then the neocon theories. Now, just to have a word from you on that, and then the issue of diminishing of Russia and all of that. Look, sitting a little distance away from all of this, to me, those are also important elements, and I'll tell you why I say so. I say they are particularly relevant because for the first time, the children of Abraham are not the only players in the world. There is a major player, China, which is knocking on the doors of, what should I say, at the very top of the global ladder. And so therefore, the idea that, you look at the Europeans, you look at even Russia in this sort of a manner, what are you gaining at the end of it? Are we possibly looking at a G2 kind of constellation? For the first time, the children of Abraham with someone else? I don't know. I'm going to stop. There are lots of people with comments. Youngsters, all of you young people, please pick up your hands, make the comments so that everyone can hear you, not just put them down in the chat boxes. That's important. But I see someone has raised his hand. And sir, please go ahead. The screen is yours.
Yeah. Rajeshwar, and thank you, Chair, for steering this wonderful discussion. And so I have two questions. The first is to Professor Barry, and that is, have economic sanctions worked? And if they have, what is the manifestation on Russia? And if they haven't, why not? What were you expecting and what didn't happen? And second is to Professor Yuriy. I am told that there is some kind of a ceasefire on the Black Sea, an understanding kind of thing, where some passage of ships is being allowed, and also long-range missile strikes are not happening. And then, of course, at some point in time, there will be some kind of negotiations or maybe an armistice, which may not lead to a peace treaty, but may kind of at least settle the situation for the moment. So what are the minimum conditionalities, in your opinion, which would be acceptable to Ukraine? Thank you.
Rajeshji, thank you very much. Excellent questions. Yuriy, I'll just add one little thing to it. The business of these ceasefires, etc., and the Russians saying lift sanctions. What do you have to say about that? So the screen is yours, Professor Barry and Professor Yuriy.
So very briefly, have the economic sanctions worked? We have to define worked, of course. I think they have imposed costs on the Russian economy. They have not been fully effective because of the continued ability of Russia to evade aspects of them, to export oil and gas, because of the shadow fleet that continues to facilitate that, because of the delay in terms of attempting to impose a ceiling on the prices of Russian oil and gas. And I will ask my fellow panelists and other people on this webinar, does India continue to import energy from Russia?
To my
I think the
mind, I
answer
think
is
it
yes.
is reduced for the moment.
Very the short answer is yes. I mean, much of it depends on prices. So, there's been apparently in the recent months some kind of decline on that, but it does. Let me say this to you. India's import of oil from Russia, in a sense, did it not stabilize global oil prices? Did it not help keep inflation in check in the United States? Look, I'm not wanting to defend any of these. I try to play the role of moderator here. But you asked a question, and I thought, let me just pitch in with the information that we have. Whether Yuriy.
Yeah, so is there a ceasefire in the Black Sea? The answer is no, there is no ceasefire. Russia wants to have a ceasefire to kind of allow Ukrainian shipping to happen in the Black Sea, but this shipping is already happening. So a lot of grain and other products are leaving Ukraine through the Black Sea. So this is just another concession from the Trump administration to solve a problem we don't have, just to be clear there. Now, do we have a ceasefire? When Trump and Putin had a phone call about a week ago, they agreed on a ceasefire that Russia is not going to strike Ukrainian infrastructure, projects and so on. Russia has been hitting this infrastructure objects every day, right? So ceasefire is non-holding. And in fact, just before this call, I was checking in the news, and Peskov, who is press secretary for Putin, said that Russia is withdrawing from this ceasefire, which is very rich because there was no ceasefire in the first place. What should happen to have some type of armistice or ceasefire? I should remind everybody here on this call that since 2014, Russia and Ukraine had about 30 ceasefires. All of them were violated by Russians at some point. So, signing another ceasefire is not meaning anything. This is just, cat and mouse game. They're not genuinely interested in peace. And also, when we think about what should happen at this stage to have some type of armistice or maybe some other diplomatic resolution, we should understand that the positions of Russia and Ukraine have irreconcilable differences. Basically, Russia wants Ukraine to capitulate. Ukraine has to die. On the other hand, Ukraine wants to live. There is no compromise between life and death, right? So the intersection there is zero. So if Russia wants to demilitarize, denazify Ukraine, it's not going to happen. If Ukraine wants to expel Russia, again, it's very difficult to achieve. And in this environment, when you have zero trust to Russia, it's very unlikely that Ukraine will sign any kind of deal without strong security guarantees. And unfortunately, the security guarantees are not forthcoming at this stage. US is not providing them. Europe is not providing them. It's not clear who's going to provide them. And that's why I'm saying that this war is going to continue for a while. I don't see any other resolution. One thing I should mention, also to follow up on Barry's point about oil flowing from Russia to India. It's true that, maybe it's stabilizing global prices for oil and everything. But, Ukraine understands that the Russian economy is basically a gas station, and you have to take out the oil sector to limit their ability to bankroll this war. And so that's why Ukraine will continue striking at oil refineries, pumping stations, maybe oil terminals, and so on. So if I were India, I would be preparing for an eventuality where Russian oil is not going to come to India.
Yuriy, thank you. I mean, this is something which is well factored in most of the concepts in India. But I'm glad you at least acknowledged the other aspects. Some of these things are such that they can't be turned around quickly. But, if I leave all of that out and I acknowledge what you just said, that the major partner is looking the other way, the other partner is kind of weak-kneed, we don't know what to say or do about it. If I just leave with you a thought, which is really an ungainly, unpleasant thought and doesn't seem to find a decent solution at all, which is something like the Korean kind of a situation, a demilitarized zone, nobody knows what's happening, a tremendous amount of geopolitical push on a constant basis, these so-called resources, really, how are anybody going to get to them, and all kinds of things. But the Europeans also losing out in terms of a degree of independence of energy and so on and so forth. What would be your reaction to
I think it's an unlikely scenario. Think about the separation in Korea. It's about what, like 150 kilometers. The front line in Ukraine is over 1,000 kilometers. It's much, 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 much bigger. Also, that DMZ thing happened when both sides were exhausted. I don't think this is happening now. Russia has not been exhausted. Ukraine has not been exhausted. So we're some time away from that.
I think you made
so as a theory.
Sorry, you made one very important point just now. There is resilience in the people of Ukraine. And for many of us sitting outside, the issues of the economy taken a hit, so many people becoming refugees, etc. The simplistic answer is that people are fatigued, but may not be. And I need to buy what you are saying. There's tremendous amount of resilience. At the end of the day, it's the Ukrainians who have put up the entire resilience, no matter the amount of arms supplies and other intelligence and so on and so forth, which may have come. So this is something that we all need to factor in. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Recently the director of the CIA was saying that Ukrainians will fight with bare hands. I think it's a fair description of what is happening in Ukraine. But if you don't trust the director of the CIA, you can look at other sources. For example, the polls of Ukrainians are showing that very, very few people want to make any kind of concession. And the vast majority of people, think about 80, maybe more % of people say that even if the US drops out from this, Ukraine should continue the fight. So this is a very strong morale.
I would just add one point, if I could quickly, that the South Korean case underscores the importance of a security guarantee for both sides, that the US has troops stationed in the South, and China entered the war and entered during the middle of the Korean War, and that was critically important for the stable division of the peninsula into two parts.
That's very true, and I think both you and Yuriy have made that point very well. Yuriy, please allow me to read one particular bit in the chat box, which I think is very important. And you may have answered it, but because it's posted there, I'm reading it up. It says, somebody is posted here. I was just wondering, should Ukraine nationalize its mineral resources to fund post-war reconstruction and give up the old ideas of privatization, etc.? Or should it open up to private investors? Which model would you think is best for the Ukraine? Full nationalization, foreign investment, or a hybrid model? And how can international organizations help in this particular thing? What would you say?
Thank you. It's a great question. As Barry said, we teamed up together to write a series of reports on how the reconstruction of Ukraine should look like. But on this specific technical point, I would say the constitution of Ukraine is saying that the minerals and everything belongs to the people of Ukraine. So it doesn't mean that nobody else can use it. People, firms, businesses, they can use it. And obviously it's one thing which can be a point of growth in Ukraine. The key question that Barry and I emphasize in our reports is that we have to have certain institutions developed to make sure that these resources are used effectively. And this will take some time. So we have to lay some groundwork work even now while the war continues. Because when the war is over, we have to have all the legal and other infrastructure to make sure that these resources are used effectively and fairly so that everybody benefits from this wealth.
No, excellent. I've been just scrolling down the chat box and I see somebody from Denmark, Dr. Manuela Dan. Are you there, Dr. Dan? You made many comments, but are you there? No, I don't see her. No, Yuriy and Barry, you're there. Why don't you say a few things on what you think on the concepts of Ukraine, minerals, and war? We have two of perhaps the best experts around here for us. So, Manuela, let's hear from you a little bit. Somebody all the way from Denmark.
Hello, I'm glad talking because now I think it's a lot of importance give at Ukraine, but at all times the war, I talking a lot about it's not exist the negotiation. I going exactly in Europe about the summit, a much person and don't accept same opinion of the Russia. It's all times I respect Hungarian people. He say impartiality. He maintain impartiality. It's a good opinion. I think the war it's not accept. And same, my opinion. I talking and I did exactly about my opinion personal. I don't did this war. It's infrastructure. It's very difficult because I'm Romanian. It's much of the people. Theoretically, I'm born in Romanian. Much people of the Europe depend of the resource of the Russian country. When I'm born young, maybe I have the 50 years. I take same communism, say democracy today. The people see it's a different way. I think it's I have a lot of experience about all the system. Infrastructure in Europe, it's more about resource of the Russia. And now the resource cut, it's for restarting construction of the infrastructure. I think it's a lot of times. It's complicated.
Okay. Dr. Dan, thank you very much. I completely understand your views that, things are complicated. And I also understand that the Europeans have benefited by a kind of relationship with the Russians, whether it is the oil, hydrocarbons, etc. That's exactly what some elements in Western polity felt that should be decoupled. And that's what exactly they've been at it, especially from the times of 2014, the Russian issues vis-a-vis Crimea and so on and so forth. We are going to be running out of time in a couple of minutes. So the screen is open to everyone. Thank you, Manuela. Thank you. The screen is open to anyone else. I would really ask those who are posting, please put up your hand and speak up so that the professors can hear you and you can have their advice directly from this. I'm leaving out comments about India because this webinar is not about India and our relationship and similarities. That's a different subject altogether. Let's stick to Ukraine, minerals, war, Russia, the Western construct, and try to understand what that means, of course, from a political economy perspective, but also from pure politics. Anyone else wants to say something? No, I think this is a complex subject. Barry and Yuriy, you have a last shot at the screen. We'd love to hear from you because I can tell you, your speaking up here gives to so many scholars here in India and in South Asia a perspective from the United States. Otherwise, in the front lines, what is the only perspective we are seeing? We're seeing what the administration is saying. We may have our own views, our personal friends, but we don't have the access to some people like you who are knowledgeable, who know what is happening, and let me say, who are willing to call a spade a spade. It's important for all of these PhD scholars and others to understand this because, in a sense, politics is linked with economy, but the economics matters also a lot. So, sir, both of you have a shot on the screen, and then we'll sum up.
Well, these are very difficult times for citizens of the United States to advise people in other countries about how to act or how to behave when we have so much trouble getting our own act together. But I think the realization that has dawned in Europe, that Europe needs to take charge of its own security, and that means the security of Europe's neighborhood, broadly defined. Other parts of the world, we were talking about South Korea before, are going to have to grapple with the same new reality now. So I think what you said before about how we are in uncharted territory is very true. And you're very gracious in asking someone who resides in the United States to provide advice about this, but you're going to have to grow your own advice at home.
Thank you. Yuriy.
I'll be very brief. Ukraine is very far from India, and it may feel like a very distant war, but whatever happens in Ukraine is going to shape the global order for many, many, many years to come. If for some reason Ukraine loses, it's going to set the world on a very dangerous trajectory. And I think it's in the interest of everybody, including India, to make sure that there is just and durable peace in Ukraine.
Puri, thank you very much. Those are lovely words, and I can tell you echo words which many people in India say, including our Prime Minister, who said this is not the time for war. But let me say a few general things to you. We coming from India, and you're right, we're some distance away, but geopolitics impacts everybody, especially a country like India, now the largest country in the world, fifth largest economy. And so we can't keep ourselves away from it. It isn't the story of 30, 40, 50 years back. We are more and more integrated into the world. But in the context of all our discussions, one little silver lining, if I may say so, that comes out is if the Europeans pony up, and what does it mean in very simple practical terms? Start paying more for defense, for national security, etc. Can we perhaps have a multipolar world in which the Europeans are a pole, the Americans there, the Chinese, the Russians, etc. For a country like India, multipolarity is perhaps particularly of great importance. Will we truly have that kind of multipolarity with the Europeans standing up, doing their own bit? Let's wait and see. Professor Charan Singh, if I have your permission, can we close the webinar? I want to thank EGROW very much for giving me this opportunity. Professor Barry Eichengreen, what an honor for someone like me, a mere practitioner of diplomacy, to be with you. And I want to ever have the opportunity of being in San Francisco to talk about the gold standard and where we are going and what populism does to everyone. And Yuriy, my heart goes out to you, my powers, all of my prayers, empathy, etc. Because I can understand how you feel, and there's no substitute for feeling, and that's particularly important. Professor Charan Singh, I hand over to you so that we can close this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all three of you, especially Ambassador Puri. It was a very difficult, I know, very, very difficult topic to handle. Want to thank you. And three of us, Professor Barry, Professor Yuriy, myself, we are from the academic world, and we enjoy that freedom of free thinking and talking and expressing ourselves. I've seen that today happen. Between three of us, I could have the courage to ask the type of questions I did. And Professor Barry and Yuriy were so honest, sometimes brutally honest in their response. I would say, Professors Barry and Yuriy, I think there are lots of lessons for people across the world. I agree with you. A new trajectory could probably happen, but also unwinding what we had done in international trade for the last 50 years is also painful to watch. And all the theories that we had developed on international trade, starting from the plain absolute advantage to the gravity and the other theories, suddenly you find are losing ground because politics has overtaken economic logic. And that's very worrisome, because at the end of the day, it's the planetary welfare that we all teach in our classes. And suddenly now you find, where is the planetary welfare? that is being discussed. And if it is enriching one country at the cost of the other, or for every altruistic move, asking for compensation, where does it end? So maybe multipolar world is the answer, or maybe as Professor Barry has mentioned, you generate your own local wisdom and live with it. The wisest, the best, the largest has nothing more to advise because they are on uncharted ground themselves. So we are in a very uncertain world. And today's discussion simply has brought that out. India had suffered for last 8 years, 800 years, when people from all directions came over and did what they did to India. When they came, we were 33% of the world GDP. Finally, when they left us with our freedom, we were 2% of world GDP. So much skeptical one has to be of friendly visitors. With that, let me conclude today's session. I want to thank each one of the participants. It is 9 p.m. now, beyond the dinner, and we have had good participation. Next week, we are continuing with this trend of late night, post-dinner fairy tale stories. We are discussing tariff war with Professor Sebnam from Brown University, and time will be 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. And a week after that, we have Nobel laureate on institutions coming and speaking to us. So I would request you to please stay tuned in. I'll send you the details. Next Friday, Professor Sebnam from Brown University, 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. Today's recording, I think today we have had a very historical discussion, which will be useful for many political parties and analysts. They should listen to the discussion of sane professors. I think they have a lot to learn, lot to gain, and lot to benefit. A Nobel Peace Prize, but will it come if you are going to get a ceasefire, but start a tariff war? At the end, you have again created another war, tariff war, and that is not going to benefit the globe. So I do not know how the Peace Prize works, but there could be a cost to it. So today's recording would be available by noon tomorrow. So you could revisit it and probably share. I'm going to share with many. You could do the same. And let me once again thank each one of you to be here with us, both the professors and ambassador and the participants. Have a great weekend. Lots to think about today's discussion, and hope to see you next week again. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.